My name is Rachel, and for 11 years I lived in a quiet cul-de-sac community called Willow Bend Estates. It was the kind of neighborhood you'd see on a postcard: trimmed lawns, matching mailboxes, a welcome sign with fresh flowers planted every spring. I loved it there. Or at least, I loved it until the day I came home from a 12-hour hospital shift and found orange traffic cones blocking the entrance to my own driveway. I want to tell you this story from the beginning, because the ending is something I still can't quite believe actually happened. If you've ever dealt with a homeowners association that seemed to forget the actual rules exist, you're going to want to stick around for this one. Part 1. The house with one way in. When my husband Mark and I bought our house on Sparrow Lane, it was a corner lot. That mattered more than we realized at the time. Most homes in Willow Bend had driveways connecting directly to the main road, but ours was different. Because of how the lot was shaped, our driveway ran along a narrow side easement that connected to a private access lane maintained jointly by 3 houses. That lane was our only way in or out. There was no back entrance, no alternate route, nothing. If that lane was blocked, we were stuck. We didn't think much about it when we bought the house. The realtor mentioned it briefly, something about a shared access easement, and our lawyer confirmed it was properly recorded on the property deed. It had worked fine for years. The other 2 families on the lane were friendly. We all took turns keeping the area clear of leaves in the fall, and nobody ever had a problem. One of those families was an older couple, Frank and Dot Ellison. Frank passed away about 4 years before any of this happened, and Dot stayed on in their house alone, a small single-story place with a ramp Frank had built for her years earlier after a knee surgery that never fully healed. Dot used a walker most days, and the lane was flat and close enough to her front door that she could manage groceries, doctor's visits, and her twice-weekly trips to see her sister across town without much trouble. The other family, the Nguyens, had 2 teenagers who used that lane every morning to catch the school bus at the corner, since the main community drive added almost a mile to the walk. So when I say the lane mattered, I don't just mean it mattered to me. It was the quiet, unremarkable kind of infrastructure that an entire small stretch of a neighborhood depended on every single day without ever thinking twice about it. That's usually how these things go, isn't it? You don't appreciate the ordinary parts of your life until someone puts up a barricade in front of them. Then, about 2 years ago, a new HOA board took over. And that's when things started to change. The new board president was a man named Gerald Pruitt, a retired accountant who had just moved into the neighborhood himself. Gerald had strong opinions about what he called aesthetic consistency and traffic control. Within his first 6 months, he pushed through new rules about mailbox colors, holiday decoration timing, and, this is the part that mattered most to me, vehicle access points. Gerald decided that the shared access lane serving our 3 houses looked, in his words, unofficial and unsightly. He wanted it gated. He wanted it landscaped over except for a narrow walking path. And most importantly, he wanted my driveway, my only driveway, closed off and rerouted through a shared HOA parking area nearly a quarter mile away. I remember the first time I heard about this plan. It was at a community meeting I almost didn't attend. Mark had a work trip, and I was exhausted from a stretch of night shifts at the hospital where I work as a charge nurse. But something told me to go, and I'm glad I did. Part 2. The meeting that started it all. The meeting was held in the clubhouse, a modest building with folding chairs and a coffee urn that always seemed to be empty by the time I got there. About 30 residents showed up that night, which was more than usual. Gerald stood at the front with a poster board diagram of the neighborhood, complete with red circles and arrows. "We are proposing," he said, tapping the board with a pointer, "to formalize the entrance to Willow Bend by closing off informal access lanes and rerouting affected residents through our main community drive." I raised my hand. "Gerald, that lane isn't informal. It's a recorded easement. It's the only access point for 3 houses, including mine." He gave me a tight smile, the kind people give when they've already made up their mind. "We understand there may be some inconvenience, Rachel, but the board believes this improves curb appeal and reduces confusion for visitors." Inconvenience. That was the word he used, for cutting off the only road to my house. I pushed back, of course. I explained that closing the lane wasn't just inconvenient, it was potentially dangerous. What if there was a fire? What if an ambulance needed to reach my house? What if Mark or I had a medical emergency in the middle of the night? The rerouted path Gerald was proposing added significant distance and required navigating through the community's shared parking lot, which was often congested with parked cars, especially on weekends. Gerald waved this off. The fire department can access any property in an emergency. That's not something the HOA needs to worry about. I didn't believe that answer was accurate, but I didn't have the paperwork to prove him wrong. Not yet. A neighbor named Priya, who lived a few doors down from me but wasn't directly affected by the lane closure, stood up next. I have to agree with Rachel, she said. My cousin is a paramedic, and she's told me stories about neighborhoods where GPS systems send emergency vehicles down roads that turn out to be blocked or gated. Every extra minute counts in a real emergency. I don't think we should be making that worse for the sake of appearance. Gerald thanked her for her input in a tone that made it clear he wasn't planning to change his mind. Another board member, a woman named Carol who handled the HOA's landscaping committee, added that the plan had already been vetted internally and that the association's attorney had reviewed the general bylaws, though I noticed she never actually said the attorney had reviewed anything related to the access lane specifically or the county's fire code requirements. At the time, I didn't catch that distinction. It wasn't until weeks later, digging through records, that I realized how much that one detail actually mattered. The vote happened that night. Despite my objections and a few murmurs of support from neighbors, the board approved the plan 5-2. I left that meeting angry, but more than angry, I was scared. I work in healthcare. I know how much minutes matter when someone is having a stroke or a heart attack. The idea that some board members thought curb appeal was worth risking that terrified me. Part 3. The cones appear. The board gave us what they called a 60-day notice period, though I later learned that wasn't nearly long enough under our state's regulations for changes affecting recorded easements. During those 60 days, I wrote letters. I called the HOA management company. I even tried to schedule a private meeting with Gerald, which he declined, citing board policy against individual negotiations. Then, on a Tuesday morning in early spring, I came home from a night shift to find orange traffic cones and a temporary wooden barricade blocking the entrance to the access lane. A laminated sign zip tied to the barricade read, "Lane closed per HOA Board Resolution 14B alternate access via Willow Bend Community Drive." I sat in my car in the middle of the street for a solid 2 minutes, just staring at it. Then I called Mark, who was still at work, and told him what happened. He was just as stunned as I was. I had to park nearly a quarter-mile away and walk home carrying my hospital bag, my lunch cooler, and a stack of mail I'd grabbed from the community mailbox cluster. It was humiliating, honestly. My elderly neighbor Dot, who lived at the other end of the lane and used a walker, was in an even worse position. She couldn't manage that kind of distance at all. Later that afternoon, I walked down to check on Dot. She was standing at her window looking out at the barricade with an expression somewhere between confusion and disbelief. When I knocked, she opened the door and just said, "Rachel, how am I supposed to get my walker past that thing?" I didn't have an answer for her. The rerouted path required navigating a curb, a stretch of gravel shoulder with no proper walkway, and then crossing through the community's shared parking lot where cars regularly backed out without checking their mirrors carefully. For someone using a walker, it wasn't just inconvenient. It was genuinely unsafe. I called the HOA's management company that same evening, a company called Bristlecone Property Partners that handled the administrative side of things for several neighborhoods in our area. The woman who answered was polite but unhelpful, explaining that all decisions regarding the closure had come directly from the board and that Bristlecone was just implementing the resolution as directed. She suggested I bring my concerns to the next scheduled meeting, which was still 3 weeks away. 3 weeks. I remember hanging up the phone and just staring at my kitchen wall for a while, thinking about how many things could go wrong in 3 weeks if that lane stayed blocked. Mark found me still sitting there an hour later and gently suggested that instead of waiting for the next meeting, I'd do some research of my own. He'd worked briefly in commercial real estate before switching careers, and he mentioned that developments like ours often had access requirements tied to their original county approval, not just whatever the current HOA board decided among themselves. That night, I sat down at my kitchen table with my laptop and a cup of coffee, and I decided I wasn't going to just accept this. I was going to find out exactly what the rules actually said, not what Gerald claimed they said, but what was legally, officially true. Part 4. Digging into the records. I started with our county's planning and zoning department website. I knew that emergency access requirements for residential developments are often governed by county or municipal fire codes, not by HOA boards, no matter how confident those boards might be about their own authority. It took a few phone calls and a couple of visits to the county records office, but I eventually found what I was looking for, the original subdivision plat for Willow Bend Estates, filed with the county more than 20 years earlier. And there it was, right on the recorded map. Our shared access lane was explicitly labeled as a designated emergency access route, required by the County Fire Marshal's office as a condition of the subdivision's original approval. This wasn't just a driveway. It was part of the neighborhood's approved emergency access plan, the kind of route fire trucks and ambulances were specifically designed to use in case the main community drive ever became blocked or impassable, say, during a bad storm, a downtree, or heavy snow. I couldn't believe it. Gerald and the board hadn't just made a bad aesthetic decision. They had potentially violated county fire code by blocking a legally required emergency access route. I spent that entire Saturday at the county records office, which was smaller and quieter than I expected, tucked into a corner of the county administration building I'd driven past 100 times without ever noticing. A clerk named Mr. Alvarez helped me pull the archive subdivision file for Willow Bend Estates, a thick folder that had clearly been sitting untouched for years. Inside was the original plat map, submitted by the developer more than 2 decades earlier, along with a stack of supporting documents, soil surveys, utility easement agreements, and, near the back, a memo from the County Fire Marshal's office dated during the original approval process. That memo was the piece that changed everything. It stated, in plain language, that the development's layout required a secondary emergency access route for the cluster of homes on Sparrow Lane, since the distance from the main community drive exceeded the maximum allowable dead-end length under the county's fire code without an alternate route. The lane behind my house wasn't an afterthought or a convenience. It existed specifically because the county wouldn't have approved the subdivision without it. I made copies of everything. The subdivision plat. The fire marshal's original approval letter, which I found referenced in the county's permit archive. And for good measure, I pulled up our state's regulations on homeowners associations, which confirmed that HOA boards do not have unilateral authority to alter or obstruct access points that were established as conditions of a county-approved development plan. I remember sitting at my table late that night, printouts spread everywhere, feeling something shift from anger into determination. I wasn't just going to complain anymore. I was going to bring proof. Part 5. Bringing it to the board. The next scheduled HOA meeting was 3 weeks away, but I didn't want to wait that long. I requested an emergency session, citing safety concerns, which our HOA's bylaws actually allowed for with enough signatures from residents. I went door to door, carefully, respectfully, not trying to start a neighborhood war, just explaining what I'd found. 14 households signed the petition within 2 days. That was more than enough. The emergency session was scheduled for the following week. I prepared like I was walking into a job interview. I organized my documents into a binder with labeled tabs: the subdivision plat, the fire marshal's approval letter, the state HOA regulations, and photos of the barricade with a tape measure showing exactly how narrow the rerouted path through the community parking lot actually was. When the night came, the clubhouse was fuller than I'd ever seen it. Word had spread. Even Dot showed up, sitting near the front with her walker parked beside her chair. Gerald opened the meeting a little too casually, clearly expecting this to be a quick formality. I understand there are some concerns about the access lane closure. Let's keep this brief. I stood up before he could move on. Gerald, I'd like the board and everyone here to see. I passed around copies of the subdivision plat map, with the emergency access designation highlighted in yellow. I explained, as calmly as I could manage, that the lane the board had closed wasn't just a shared driveway. It was a legally designated emergency access route, established as a condition of the neighborhood's original development approval by the county fire marshal. The room went quiet. A few board members leaned over to look at the highlighted section on their copies. This map, I continued, shows that our access lane is part of the county's approved emergency response plan for this subdivision. Blocking it isn't just inconvenient for 3 households. It's a violation of county fire code, and frankly, it could be a serious liability issue for this HOA. Gerald tried to recover. We were told this was simply a private easement between a few residents. Nobody informed the board of any emergency designation. With respect, I said, the board never asked. This information is public record. It took me 1 visit to the county planning office to find it. Part 6. The county gets involved. I hadn't stopped at just presenting the map. Before the meeting, I had also filed a formal inquiry with the county fire marshal's office, describing exactly what had happened and attaching photos of the barricade. I wanted an official response, not just my own interpretation of an old document. About a week after the emergency HOA session, That response arrived, not just to me, but to the HOA's management company as well, since I had made sure to note them as a party involved in the obstruction. The letter was polite but unmistakably firm. It confirmed that the access lane in question was indeed designated as a required emergency vehicle route under the subdivision's original approval conditions. It stated that any obstruction of this route, including barricades, cones, gates, or landscaping features that reduce the lane's usable width below the required emergency vehicle clearance, would constitute a fire code violation. The letter gave the HOA 30 days to remove the obstruction and restore full access, or face further enforcement action, which could include fines levied against the association itself. I'll admit, when I read that letter, I actually had to sit down. Not because I was surprised the lane was protected. I already knew that from the subdivision plat. I was surprised at how quickly, and how seriously, the county took it once presented with clear documentation. I forwarded a copy to the HOA's management company and, out of fairness, directly to Gerald as well. I didn't want to blindside anyone. My goal was never to humiliate the board. I just wanted my driveway back, safely and legally. Part 7. The barricade comes down. The board didn't wait the full 30 days. Within a week, a maintenance crew arrived and removed the barricade, the cones, and the laminated sign. No formal announcement, no apology posted to the community board, just a quiet undoing of what had been done. I happened to be home when it came down. I stood on my porch and watched the crew fold up the wooden barricade and load it into a truck, and I felt this wave of relief wash over me that I hadn't fully expected. It wasn't triumphant, exactly. It was more like finally being able to breathe normally again after weeks of holding my breath every time I drove or walked toward my own house. Dot came out of her house too, leaning on her walker, and gave me a small wave and a thumbs up. I walked over and we stood together for a few minutes, just watching our lane, our actual, functional, legally protected lane, being restored to what it always should have been. Part 8. The Aftermath. The next regular HOA meeting was very different from the ones before it. Gerald opened by acknowledging that the board had moved forward with the lane closure proposal without fully verifying the underlying access designations, which was about as close to an apology as Gerald was ever going to get, I think. Two other board members were more direct, thanking me for bringing the documentation forward and admitting they should have asked more questions before the original vote. The board formally rescinded Resolution 14B. They also passed a new internal policy requiring any proposed changes to shared access points, driveways, or roadways to be cross-checked against county subdivision and fire code records before being brought to a vote. I like to think that policy exists today because of what happened to me, Mark, and Dot on that lane. Gerald didn't run for board president again the following year. I don't know if that was directly because of this situation or just general neighborhood frustration that had been building for a while, but either way, new leadership came in with what I'd describe as a much more collaborative approach. They actually formed a small resident advisory committee before making changes to shared infrastructure, which seems like basic common sense, but apparently wasn't the standard practice before. Part 9. What I learned. Looking back on everything, there are a few things I took away from this experience that I think are worth sharing, especially if you're dealing with something similar in your own community. First, HOA boards, even well-meaning ones, don't always have full legal authority to make the changes they propose. Board members are usually volunteers, often without legal or planning backgrounds, and sometimes decisions get made with good intentions but incomplete information. That doesn't excuse the outcome, but it does explain how something like this can happen. Second, public records are exactly that, public. County planning departments, fire marshal offices, and property record archives usually make subdivision plats, easement records, and zoning documents available to anyone who asks, often for free or a small copying fee. I didn't need a lawyer to find the information that ultimately resolved this situation, though I want to be clear that consulting one earlier probably would have saved me some of the stress and back and forth. Third, documentation matters more than emotion in these situations. I was furious when I found those cones blocking my driveway, and I had every right to be. But what actually changed the outcome wasn't my frustration at that first meeting. It was the calm, organized presentation of an actual recorded map with an actual fire marshal designation. Boards and neighbors alike respond to evidence in a way they simply don't respond to complaints, however justified those complaints might be. And finally, community matters. I couldn't have gathered 14 signatures for that emergency session without neighbors who were willing to stand with me, even ones who weren't directly affected by the lane closure. Dot, who lived at the far end of that lane and relied on it daily with her walker, was one of the first people to sign. She told me later that she almost didn't go to that original meeting where the vote happened, the same way I almost didn't go. We were both glad we did. Part 10. Where things stand now. Today, the lane is fully open, clearly marked, and included as a permanent item on the HOA's maintenance checklist. There's actually a small metal sign near the entrance now, added by the new board, identifying it as a designated emergency access route, which feels like a strange kind of indication every time I drive past it. Mark jokes that I should frame the subdivision plat map and hang it in our hallway, like some kind of trophy. I haven't done that, but I did keep the binder. Every document, every letter, every photo. Just in case. I still live in Willow Bend Estates. Despite everything, I actually like it here. The new board has been reasonable, the neighborhood is quiet again, and Dot and I have grown close over the 2 years since all of this happened. We wave to each other from our porches most evenings, and she still likes to remind me, with a laugh, that I once measured a parking lot with a tape measure to prove a point. If there's one thing I'd want anyone watching this to take away, it's this: don't assume that because a decision comes from an official-looking board or committee, it's automatically correct or automatically final. Ask questions. Look up the actual records. And if you ever find yourself standing in front of a barricade blocking the only way into your own home, know that the truth is usually sitting quietly in a filing cabinet somewhere, waiting for someone patient enough to go find it. Thank you for listening to my story. If you've ever dealt with an HOA dispute of your own, I'd genuinely love to hear how it turned out. Sometimes the best solutions really do come down to a map, a little research, and neighbors willing to stand together.